So we're getting into our last panel session. It's the urban diaspora, learning Indigenous languages away from homelands. And it's my delight to call upon our moderator. You've heard from her yesterday as one of our keynotes, Dr. Lorna Williams, to ask her to come forward. As you know, she serves in many capacities. I still giggle when I see the word Professor Emeritus. Emerita means retired. I've never seen this lady look more busy than with this quote-unquote Emerita behind her name. But please help me in welcoming her to this stage.
I know that us old ones don't retire. In our communities, I know it's the old people who keep us going, and I'm just so grateful now to be one of those. And so for this session, I would like to invite the panelists to come into their chairs. The purpose of this panel is to highlight Indigenous language revitalization in urban places and in places where people go away from their homelands. All over this planet, and especially this is what I know as to what's happened here in Canada, there has been much effort to remove us from our homelands. And it's important that we don't forget that people who live away from home are still part of those homelands and have the right to have access to their language. And these three people have been doing this work and have taught me much about what we need to be able to do to support those people. So first, I would like to introduce Daniel Kaufman from New York. Daniel, I won't read everything he's done here, is a professor, he's a linguist, he's a language champion. He runs an organization in New York for those people who come from all over the world to make their homes there. He works with people who speak only an Indigenous language. And he's been working with groups to be able to make sure that they have access. People in New York come with language. And many times they have no opportunity to hear that language, except when there are special people like Daniel who create those opportunities. And so welcome, Daniel. And I'd like to introduce Eddie Avila, whose language activism I think has been a story here at the conference. He resides in Bolivia. He's the director of Rising Voices, the digital inclusion initiative of the Global Voices. Through training, mentoring, network building, Rising Voices works directly with communities interested in adopting and adapting technology to address one's language and cultural needs. And so I'd like to welcome Eddie. The third person is Pasang Sherpa, who I've just met, but have heard much about. And her area is indigeneity and language in the diaspora, language sharing via online media and video. Pasang is a PhD. She's an anthropologist from Nepal. Her primary research areas include human dimensions of climate change, indigeneity, and development in the Himalayas. And we've heard much about the impacts of climate change, and in the Himalayas. And so I'm really pleased that we were able to welcome her here and to share her knowledge and her thoughts with us. Welcome. Okay. So I'd like to begin first with Daniel. Daniel, your organization is based in New York. It creates and provides spaces for people to bring their languages. Can you tell us the story of the work that you do to support language learning, and what has helped you to successfully deliver these services?
Thank you. Let me first say this is really the honor of a lifetime to be invited to a conference that is truly by and for Indigenous people. Thank you to you, Lorna, to Tracy, to all of the organizers, to the Indigenous owners of the land. So my story in New York is, you could say, started with the realization, well, I mean, you have the same situation here in this room, that there's more language knowledge in this room, maybe even in half of this room, than there is in all of the language archives in the world, right? And why is that so? Because it's the generative power of language that people hold in their minds rather than a static recording or a book. And in New York, I came to this realization that in every restaurant and every deli and every taxi almost, there is an Indigenous person who should be treated as a cultural treasure, and in many cases is a genocide survivor, and is being paid $5, say, to wash dishes, for instance. And that seemed to be beyond the injustice, the sheer stupidity of it became unbearable. And so that was the beginning of my motivation, you could say. In cities, when you look at it, they seem to represent a tremendous brain drain, and in particular an Indigenous brain drain, because we know that the urbanization of Indigenous people is far outpaces the general urbanization of the population. So what can be done to reverse that? And there's a lot of loneliness and desperation in cities, right? People feel disconnected, right? So what can be done to reverse that? You know, Joshua Fishman, who's was a famous scholar and a language activist. His father always used to ask him, what did you do for Yiddish today, right? And here were all of these people who just simply had no opportunity to do anything for their language. They didn't have the time, they didn't have the space. But out of this desperation, like as you said in your talk, it should be turned into something positive, and it could be turned into a strength, right? We could look at the humorous example of Italy and Switzerland, right? Italy had the wars and famine and constantly fighting, but out of that came, you know, Dante and Michelangelo and all of these fantastic poets and artists. Switzerland, on the other hand, they had peace and prosperity and wealth, and what did they create? The cuckoo clock, right? So out of this pain, I think we should really be able to get the same kind of beauty. So we work mostly with two types of learners, I would say. There's learners who are kind of what are called here silent speakers, you could say. And those are the ones I enjoy working with the most, because I feel I see myself in them, because I also grew up kind of with a passive knowledge of my parents' language, and I turned it into an active knowledge. And it's wonderful to work with those people. I work with them mostly by having them really engage with texts and recordings in a very intense way, and in a way that they couldn't even do at home, excuse me. And you can see them really blossoming and flourishing, and that's a very powerful thing. But then there's also learners who are not silent speakers, people who are extremely disconnected to their language, and languages that have no first language speakers at all. So the example of the Lenape, for instance, there's a Lenape teacher who drives 10 hours from Muncie, Ontario, once a month to give a 3-hour class to a group of hardcore revitalizers. And that's a different situation, but as one person in the class said, and I mentioned this in my talk a few days ago, it was such a good quote that I was somehow sure that maybe she heard it somewhere, but I think she actually did come up with it herself. Her name is Crystal Cuddebeck. She said, we're not revitalizing the language is revitalizing us, right? And this was true on several levels. On one level, we obviously don't have the resources to revitalize the language in New York City with no fluent speakers, very few materials. Yes, a dictionary, but really that's it. But on the other hand, we're doing something else. We're creating a community in a space. We're letting the language recreate a community that was also broken. Right? So on one hand, you can have a community that brings back a language, and here you have a language that is bringing back a community from all different areas of the Lenape diaspora. So the importance, I think, is the physical space. I can't give enough emphasis to this physical space, especially in this age where everything is electronic and cyber. I'm kind of a cyber skeptic a little bit, because you can see that the power of entering a space where people are focused on one mission, and they can be from all over the world, but they share something and they feel it, right? I mean, when I open up Facebook, I don't feel anything. Well, I feel sometimes nauseous, especially when I open up my own page. But when you have a physical space, this is something, I think that indigenous people here and my people, the Jews, understand the value of real estate. A physical space is key, and I think that's really what helps bring all of our people together. Sorry for taking so much time.
No, good. Thank you, Daniel, for those words that I, especially on technology, because that's what I'm going to invite Eddie to talk about. And so, Eddie, why is it important to provide language learning outside of the homeland? And what do you think will happen if we don't act on that to ensure that all Indigenous peoples have access to their languages?
Thank you. Again, I would like to also thank the organizers of the conference. It's really an honor to be here. And we were talking among some of the Latin America colleagues here how there's such a great potential for exchange and learning across regions. Yeah. I think that's something we'd love to work on to see how we can make that happen. And so I live in Bolivia, and Bolivians are famous or infamous of going abroad, of moving to other places for opportunities for work, for study, but mainly for work. A large population can be found in the Washington, D.C. area, in Madrid, in Buenos Aires. And my own family has a history of migration. My parents moved to the United States and to a small town in the middle of the country. And I experienced my own loss of maternal language, in that case Spanish, but also my language of my grandmother, which is Quechua. That was kind of low on the priority. And so I understand how something like moving away from home can affect how people speak, but also identity. But I also want to talk about internal migration in Bolivia. The city of El Alto, Bolivia, has about a population of about 1 million people. Around 90% are migrants from the Aymara migrants from the Altiplano. And so in the 80s and 90s, well-meaning parents discouraged their kids from keeping their language or keeping their culture because of the society of discrimination, because they felt like if they learned Spanish or maybe a foreign language like English and now Chinese, then maybe the opportunities for work or study would be much higher. But fortunately, a lot of that is changing for different reasons. People are realizing that it's not either or. You can learn 2 languages at once. And many of the students who are now in the university are trying to reverse that. And I heard a really interesting quote at one of the sessions this morning, I think from the gentleman who was working on the Cayuga language about the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, the second best time is now. And so a lot of these young people are trying to make up for lost time, deciding to do things on their own by using technology to create content, to just speak to one another in the language. And I think that's a very powerful thing. A couple of years ago, the first thesis was written in Aymara, and there's a video online where the student is defending the thesis in Aymara, and it was really interesting to see. So things are changing in Bolivia. In the outskirts of Washington, D.C., there's a school called Escuela Bolivia, which was founded by Bolivian immigrants who first saw that their kids were losing Spanish, and so they taught Spanish to the sons and daughters of immigrants. But now they're introducing Quechua classes. One of my friends is a teacher there. It's kind of a way to just introduce this, because we know it's a rough time for immigrants, especially in the United States, and sometimes language and culture isn't always on the top of priority. But I think there are groups that are doing that. We supported a project in Buenos Aires with the Mapuche community. If you get a chance to speak to Arturo, he's here from Chile. He's doing lots of great things in Santiago, Chile. But they are just kind of getting people together to talk in Mapudungun. And I think that's a really positive sign that people are not waiting around for governments to do that or institutions to do that, but they're forming their own collectives to do it themselves. And then I'm sure maybe Daniel knows about this group in New York, but Quichua Hatari, which is a radio station that is transmitting in Quechua, but it's a way for also them to communicate amongst that community, but connect with their community in Ecuador. So I think the internet is really breaking down barriers, whether geographic or other barriers. And I think the last question is about access. I think it's important to have learning materials, but I think it's also having access to content, role models, representation in the media, and that could be its own conference in itself. So I think there are positive signs where our groups are coming together to say that this is important and that they could do something about it. But I think that's, we'll talk a little bit more about technology a little later.
Thank you, Eddie. And Pasang, what practices or values in the Himalayan community of New York have contributed to their language and culture maintenance? And what advice would you give to urban communities who want to keep their languages and cultures strong?
First of all, thank you so much for the question, and thank you so much to the organizers and the helpers who are making this possible. Tashitele, I'm Pasang Sherpa. I'm from Nepal. So one of the things Mark Turin, and I presented a paper yesterday with, so one of the things we were talking about was how a lot of Nepali people are moving outside Nepal and finding themselves in places like New York. And in fact, for the Sherpa community, who are only less than 1% of the total Nepali population, so we are a very small ethnic minority. And we are also an indigenous group from the mountain region of Nepal, northeastern part of Nepal. But the second largest concentration of Sherpas in one location after Kathmandu now is Queens, New York. So if you want to find a Sherpa person, you have a good chance of finding a Sherpa in New York than, let's say, in Nepal. So that being said, in terms of cultural values that have helped Sherpas, the one thing I found to be very important is the interest from the community to preserve language. I think that's the most important factor. And then, similar to like the interest from the community, it's also very important to have the resources available for them. The space for, like Daniel was saying, the space for them to be able to speak their language or practice their culture. So I think interest from the community, availability of resources, and the space, all of those are very important. The second thing I want, to your second question, I do want to point out that I don't know if I'm a good person to give an advice or give advice to anyone else, but I would point out that for the Sherpas and the Himalayan people, I think we do have somewhat of an advantageous position, because the good thing and the bad thing about the Sherpas is a lot of people know about the Sherpas. And a lot of people know about the Sherpas because of their association with the high mountains. And so, let's comparing the case of Sherpas in New York to a Bolivian indigenous person in New York. I think the Sherpas are going to get more attention from the media, from the local authorities, and therefore are in a better position in that sense. But that being said, I think it is still very difficult for us to continue our language if we don't do anything. And earlier during the New Zealand session, one of the things that was shared was how right now we might look around us and see so many people speaking our language, but we have to realize that most of them are older people and elders. And in the next 5, 10, 15 years, it's up to us, the younger people, to carry on and to continue to speak the language. So that's important. And the last thing I want to also point out here is for many indigenous people like myself, the fact that I'm here and I'm able to speak is because I had to go to school and I had to learn English. And because of the fact that I can speak in English, I can tell you about my experience. But a lot of indigenous peoples around the world are not able to use English and are not able to share their experiences. So I think that's also something I would like to highlight. But the fact that we are able to gather in this conference and share our experience and support each other in language revitalization is very important, and thank you so much.
Thank you for that. And because we don't have much time, I would like to go on to ask another question. What advice would each of you have for individuals who no longer live in their language homelands to be able to continue their languages? And especially, I think, for those who live away from their homelands, for those who, so many people in this country have been removed from their homelands because for social services reasons, for health reasons, for economic reasons, and so because they've been living away, what advice would you have for them to be able to connect with their language?
Well, I can say two things, I suppose. There's the question of ideology, first of all, which is that all of us have beliefs about language, and nobody should be told to change their beliefs about language, but it's important to step outside of those beliefs and say, this is affecting my language choices, and is this an adaptive belief, right? Because some cultures will think, you know, if there's even one person in the room that doesn't understand me, I'm not going to speak in my language. That's fine if that whole culture believes that and other cultures believe that. But now we have a confrontation, which is the colonial confrontation, really, and we see it today in cities, where you have cultures that are thankful and giving and sharing, right? So in this conference, for instance, I see this. And what happens when a culture like that encounters a culture that's like this? right? My culture is in between. If you put something in front of us, we go like this. That's all? But my wife comes from this culture, and so I'm trying to raise my kids like that, but they're kind of in between. So but that's an important thing to understand that, and we've done hundreds of interviews with people in New York, and you can see the massive differences in their beliefs. But when is it appropriate to use my language? And we have to, again, I'm not saying think this way or think that way, but realize that you have an ideology and that is playing into the survival of your language. That's one thing. The second thing is completely concrete. It's the only thing I've actually seen work beautifully in New York City. I've seen many things there. The only thing I've really seen that's effective was a group of people who rented an apartment together and banned English in their apartment. And nothing else compared to that, you know. And it didn't matter if you didn't speak the language that they were trying to speak. None of them were born in the language. None of them were really fluent speakers at the time. That's okay. You could speak Spanish, you could speak French, as long as you didn't speak English, right? So it reminded me of a Mohawk leader in the New York area, Tom Porter, who said that he wanted to build a residential school in reverse, right? So that was a small version of that, and it really worked. So people have to create that, they have to find each other in cities, right? They have to find each other. I was reminded yesterday, looking at that beautiful group, SÍLÁ, right? The Inuit throat singers. Actually, they did. If you hear them, you think this is the voice of the ancestors, but they didn't learn it from their grandmothers. They only picked it up once they moved to the city. They realized the need. They realized what they were missing, right? So you have to find each other, first of all, in the city, and you have to create that space and make some rules, really. It's hard. I'm not saying I'm successful in it either, but that's what I've seen, which really works.
Thank you, Daniel.
So we do work with a lot of individuals, young people especially, in this concept we call language digital activism. And so I think the majority go beyond than just speaking and writing in their language or communicating. And as we saw yesterday, Tetaka, who talked about the hardcore digital activism, that a major component of that is the desire to share what they know. And I think, you know, on a whole, the 50 or so we work with on a regular basis, especially in Latin America, they have this great desire to share what they know because they know they need help. They can't do this on their own. And so a lot of it is sharing what you know using the internet, because the internet is kind of the great equalizer for all of its flaws, for all the problems we know that the internet has, but there's still pockets of positivity and you know, potential there. But I think it's something. It's still a process. When we hold gatherings, every once in a while we convene a space for young people to come together and share what they know. We write on the application, what do you want to learn? What can you share? What can you teach as well? Because we really feel it's a very important, more powerful to have this peer learning model. And so those spaces are kind of this entry point for them to realize that they're not alone in this, even though they may connect with another young person who speaks another language, but they can still find commonalities and some of their challenges. But when we do these workshops in this application process, at least in Latin America, many people are very, very modest, that they don't want to talk about themselves. They don't want to, you know, share or talk too much about what they're doing, because they feel like they're, you know, bragging or being conceited. But I think once you get to know them, like, oh, but you left all this out on your application. This is really great stuff. It could really help others. And so it's something, it's still a process. And so, you know, the internet is one way for people to kind of showcase what they're doing and not wait around for the media to come and write a story on their project, but they could be their own media. And just kind of a little plug that we're doing, we have these social media campaigns where every week a different language activist takes control of a Twitter account. It's a common Twitter account. And we're doing one together with Endangered Languages Project, one for First Nations and Native American communities. And so it's called Native Langs Tech. And we have one of the participants is here. I haven't met him yet. I hope I get to meet Rory. He's here, and he took over the week a couple of weeks ago. And so it's a way for them to share their story directly, access maybe a new audience, but it's a really powerful way. And so if anyone is interested in participating, please tweet at us or come up to me. We'd love to have you talk about your language, how technology is helping you in your language revitalization work. But it's a good way for people to share what they know on a different platform.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I want to agree with both of them and kind of echo what they're saying, but I want to actually approach your question slightly differently. And I do so because I think sometimes when you're an Indigenous person trying to yeah, so you know what I'm trying to say, even me without saying it. But I think sometimes we just get told what to do. And we get told a lot of things. Mm-hmm. We need to do this, we need to do that, we need to do this, and we need to do that. And it's just too much. So instead of answering your question in that sense, I think both of them have already answered that. So what I would like to contribute to this conversation is, how do you do that then? How do you do what Dan said? How do you do what you have said? And I think humor helps, and positivity always helps, and finding friends always helps. And I think not undervaluing those qualities will be crucial for us to sustain our momentum and move forward. And doing whatever we can, wherever we are, with whatever is available to us. I think that's the way to go. But that being said, so in my, and I also emphasize this because like many of you might have already experienced this, you know, when you're the diversity person, or you're the only person, Indigenous person, or person of color, or immigrant, or whatever the labels that are put onto you, you get pulled in different directions. But sometimes I think just knowing and choosing one thing that you can do well and being the best at that, I think that really helps. And finding good collaborators, finding good partners, and a nurturing environment is crucial to keep moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you. I just can't avoid telling the story. I was in a community at a meeting, and we were having supper. And the supper place was in front of the residential school. And I was sitting with a group, and there was an elderly man sitting across the table from me. And he was telling me that he went to that residential school, and that he asked me, "Did you notice how worn the steps are?" And I said, "Yes," you know, and I was thinking because so many people went up and down them. He said, "That was because every time I spoke my language, I had to scrub those steps." And this community that I was in, I had always been told all my life that, you know, that this was a while ago, that language was extinct, that it was no longer. But this community, through the help of this man and other people like him who had gone away and had come back to the community, was the reason why the language continued. And so I asked him, you know, because he said he left the school and he had to leave his community. And he went and he lived in a city far away in another country. And so I asked him, I said, "So how did you keep your language going in all those years living in a city where where you didn't have anyone else to speak with. And his story always stays with me. Because he said, I would go to work. He worked as a longshoreman. So he'd go to work early, and he'd come back to his rooming house. And what he did was every night, after he had his dinner, he would sit facing a wall, and he would speak to Naha. That's how he kept his language alive in a city, all by himself. He didn't have a community there. And so there are many people I know who live away from their homes, and they retain their language. But we need to be able to find ways to be able to support those people. And so what can organizations in urban centers do and in communities? Because also in our part of the world, there are communities who organize and find ways to support their members in urban centers to be able to retain their language, their cultural knowledge, and their sense of identity. And so, can you give us any advice to organizations who might be able to support their people?
It's a tricky question. I think in our case, it was the absence of a framework, kind of like Pasang was saying. It was the absence of rules and a framework that really allowed people to do what they want. So we just said, here is a space. This is spaces for everybody who wants to help a struggling language. And you can teach here, and you can work on texts here, and you can do whatever you want, and we'll help you with the few resources we have. And that was enough. Had we said, okay, we're imposing, these are our activities, and this is our language, and this is this, then it wouldn't have worked, right? But the point was that we were open to everyone, and it was an all-purpose space, right? And as far as you can imagine, you can do that here within our resources. You could do radio, you could do videos, you can do this or that. So I think it was kind of the path of, I don't know what path that is, but the lack of a framework, but letting people know that here is a space dedicated to language, and that was enough because there's nothing else like it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. Pasang, I'd like you to have your last word.
I think a place to connect and meet like this is very, very important. And I would really encourage any individual or organization that is present today or listening to this talk to find ways to create environments like this where we can connect with each other and learn from each other. Even in this 2-3 days, I was able to learn so much, and I hope I was able to share some of my experiences that were helpful to others. And so just finding this space has been really, really good, and I hope we'll do that. And I just want to quickly make a comment about how different I felt in this conference, which is important because the other conference my mind kept going to was the Permanent Forum, the United Nations Permanent Forum meeting, which I absolutely value for the platform it has provided for Indigenous peoples. But when I attended that meeting, I felt like an outsider trying to be there, but I did not feel like that here. And so,
Thank you.
So really quickly, so some of the students we know in Bolivia, when they are bridges between their rural communities and the city, since they are in university, they go back home and they can't stay very long because they have to do homework, they need to do work, and the internet connection there is non-existent or very slow. And so I think that's really an important part of this. Sometimes communities that want to retain people and they try to create favorable conditions, and part of that is having internet connection, and not just internet connection, but affordable internet connection. Because in some parts of the world, the internet may be the same price, but the percentage of income is much higher in kind of developing countries. And so I think being able to lobby for affordable and access is really important. But many communities are doing it for themselves as well. Community networks, I know here in Canada, there's lots of great examples of last mile technology where they connect communities that are really rural, because it is, an important right to be able to have that access. So I think that's something that organizations can join those advocacy initiatives for affordable internet.
Thank you very much. And I need to close this session, and so I'd like you to show your thanks to the 3 panelists.